Well, welcome to the Calvary Chapel Salmon podcast. If you're watching us right now, you might be thinking, man, Jordan and Hagen have just gone crazy. They're really just changing things up. And you'd be a little bit right. We're sitting in Hagen's office right now. The door's closed, and we're hoping that nobody comes down and is going to interrupt us.
That's right.
But we're having a good time, and we're doing it in here because we need to record some extra ones because
someone's leaving for the holidays.
yeah, someone's going back to Cali.
Gosh.
Not where I'm from, where Avery's from, to see her family. There's a misconception, Hagen, that people think I'm from California, and that's not true one bit.
That is not true.
So don't even think
You're
that.
obviously an East Coast
That's
fella.
for sure. Yep. So we have to kind of record some extra ones in advance, and right now school's going on, and so we thought, why not just come and do it over here? So
Well, because Jordan, you made a profound statement yesterday.
sure, yep.
And what did you say? Do you remember?
I said, Hagen, because we have the habit of maybe recording these either on days that we don't work too much or late at night. And I said, Hagen, how about we just like work during work hours? Like the podcast is kind of like a job. And so how about we just do that while we're working? And so we're trying that out a little bit.
What a great idea.
Mm-hmm. So Hagen, what are we talking about today?
Well, we're continuing on part 2 of
That's
our
true.
overview of the Bible. Last episode, we made it through the first 5 books of the Bible, those first 5 books of Moses, they're often called. And we did a great job, I would say,
I think we did great,
summarizing
yeah.
from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Just kind of looking at what storyline is kind of taking place there. And we're just going to continue on through the Old Testament today and then hit the New Testament in part 3.
Yeah. So we're hoping to do the entire Old Testament, all
From Joshua
34
to
books, Malachi,
all the way.
as some like
So
to say, yes, Malachi. Well, let's just dive right on in, Hagen. So the first book, we've done Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
so we left off with God's people
Yes.
on this side of the promised land, still in the wilderness.
Mm.
Moses
Yep.
is dead, and God needs to keep his promises. God is going to get his people to where he wants them. And it's like, well, who's God going to use to lead his people into the promised land? And the answer is
Joshua.
That's
Joshua.
right.
Moses, he is the lawgiver. On Mount Sinai, he brought down the 10 Commandments. He's the lawgiver. Big, important deal. But Moses couldn't bring the children of Israel into the promised land. They need someone else to do that. Joshua, and Joshua's name means Yahweh is salvation. It's the same name that Jesus has, just in the Jesus is the, how does that work? Jesus is the Hebrew name, or Jesus is the,
Well, Jesus is the
because
English
Jesus
name.
means Joshua. Well, both, yes.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Joshua is Hebrew for what we would call Jesus. Jesus would be the Greek, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Jose would be the Spanish.
Yes. And then Jesus is just English. Yeah. We just turn that to Jesus. Well, anyways, Joshua and Jesus, their names mean Yahweh salvation. Jesus' name basically means Joshua. And Jesus is the one who is able to, or Joshua is the one who's able to do what Moses couldn't and bring God's people into the promised land. And that's true for us.
That's right. So they get, and so Joshua being one of those 12 spies that went in and spied out the land, had a positive report, him and Caleb. So Joshua's been there before.
Yes.
One of the, actually only 2 people, him and Caleb, that are still alive that have been in there. So God picks him to lead them across. So it's the wilderness, then it's the, ironically, Jordan River.
Wow.
That separates it, and then it's the promised land on the other side. So what type of miracle does God use to get his people from the wilderness to the promised land with Joshua? Well, actually, even before that, who's an important character in the first part, even before they ultimately cross over? Because they send spies out again, right? They send 2 more spies into the land in Joshua, and these spies encounter someone named who?
Ooh, Rehoboam.
Rahab.
Yes. Not Rehoboam.
Rahab.
That's a king
the what?
later on. She's the harlot.
Rahab the harlot there and she lives in the walls of Jericho, the city, right?
Yes.
And they encounter her, and she actually helps hide them out and rescue them. And they make this deal that when we come in to conquer the land, we'll spare you. And what's the sign for her to be spared?
She needs to hang down this scarlet thread.
This scarlet rope, this scarlet thread out of her window. And that will be the sign that that window, that household is a friend of God, is someone that's going to be spared. So they have an encounter with Rahab, and then they end up crossing the river. And as they cross the Jordan River,
it parts.
Similar to the Red Sea.
Yep.
Parting, they cross through. The priests lead the way as they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders. Everyone gets to cross on the other side. And Jordan, this is real interesting. Now that God's people are finally in the promised land in those first several chapters of the book of Joshua, do you know what the first thing is that God has his people do why they make it to the other side, while they're in this season of waiting before they go out and march around Jericho?
Don't they set up rocks, right?
Okay, the remembrance stones, but also snip, snip.
Oh, so they get recircumcised. Yes.
Right. Well, you can only be circumcised once, but
yes,
because
they had all their kids and they
in the wilderness
they
never did circumcision. So God goes, now that you are my people and now you're in my promised land, I need you to catch back up on this covenant. So everyone needs to be circumcised. They get that done there, and they need to go conquer their first place. And the first place they conquer is Jericho. And Jericho has these walls, and God has his people conquer this in Joshua in kind of a unique way. He doesn't tell them to go with sledgehammers and bulldozers and tear down that wall, like Reagan said to whoever that was over there in whatever place that
Germany,
was.
yes. Berlin, yeah.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall.
For sure. No, they don't do that. No.
Instead, what does God have his people do?
He has them march around the wall.
He goes, I just want you to march around the wall for how many days? Do you know?
7 days.
7 days. And on that 7th day, they're to march 7 times. They're to blow their trumpets. They're to shout. And God promises that those walls of Jericho will come a-tumbling down. And is that what happened?
Yes, it is.
It's exactly what happened. They faithfully march around 6 days. On that 7th day, they do it 7 times. They blow their horns. They give a great shout. And sure enough, the walls miraculously come crashing down. And what we see here, a great pattern that's starting in Joshua, is now that God's people are in the promised land, they're in the place that God wants them to be. But now they need to possess what God wants them to possess. He's given it to them, but they need to possess it. And what he does is he gives them all of these acts of faith to do in order to possess the promises that he wants to give them. And that parallels well in our lives. The Bible says that all the promises of God in Christ Jesus are yes and amen. That we have it. We have the victory. We possess what Jesus wants us to have, or we've been given what Jesus wants us to have. We just need to now step out in faith and possess it. So Joshua's a great book that we learn from. We have God's promises. We have his word. We know what he says, what he wants to do through us and to us. And the way that we get that in our life is by taking those steps of faith, whether it's that step of faith into the Jordan River, trusting it's going to cross, those steps of faith around the walls of Jericho, trusting they're going to fall down. And Joshua, it's a battle book. It's a book of battle strategy and having victory over the enemy.
Yeah, and that's interesting because they're in the promised land, and you would think, oh, we make it to the promised land. It's the land flowing with milk and honey, and everything's going to be nice and easy. But it's no, you enter into the promised land, and like we talked about last time, the promised land. Sometimes we just think, oh, you cross over the Jordan, and we sing that song where it's like, oh, some glad day I'll cross over the Jordan, I'll fly away. And we see as like that's going into heaven. Well, that's not quite right, because in heaven, we're not fighting battles against giants. At least I don't think we are. Probably not. Yes. We're not fighting battles in heaven. When we get to heaven, all battles cease. Entering the promised land is entering, like you just said, into what God has for you, into what Jesus has for you. But just because you're entering into what Jesus has for you doesn't mean it's all going to be sunshine and roses. There's going to be battles. There's going to be things. There's going to be tough things. You're going to have to fight against the enemy. honestly, when they enter into the promised land, they fight more battles there than they did when they were in Egypt or when they were in the wilderness. They fight more battles there
Mm,
because whenever we start saying yes to Jesus, the devil, our enemy, hates that, and he'll
mm,
try and take us down. If we're just going with the flow, we're just doing whatever, we're just being Christians who just do whatever and are normal and just kind of live life and don't really think about Jesus or walking in him or doing what he wants us to do, the devil will mostly probably just leave us alone. But the
mm.
second we say, you know what, I'm going to pray, I'm going to claim what Jesus has for me, then we put a target on our back, the back of our head, and the enemy will start attacking us.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're settling in the promised land. And as you read Joshua, each tribe gets their section of the
Yes.
promised land. And it goes into detail there. And this tribe gets this place, this tribe gets that place. 2.5 tribes don't want to settle in the promised land.
Yes.
Um,
Ephraim and Manasseh, the half tribe of Manasseh.
yeah.
Oh, and no,
Root.
one tribe, yeah, Ephraim and Gad. One tribe only wants to go halfway in. Half Manasseh goes and half Manasseh stays out.
Ephraim, Gad, and the half tribe of Manassah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep, and Gad. Yep.
So they go right when they're on the edge before crossing over. They go, we like it here.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we want to go in there? We're happy here. And the deal that's made is and this is perfect language, if you want to settle outside of God's promise, you can. And they do.
Yep.
Ephraim, Gad, and a half tribe of Manasseh don't settle in the promised land. They settle on the other side. But the deal was, you need to go in and help us conquer.
Mm-hmm.
And then when that's done, you can go back and have your inheritance. And that's what they choose.
Yep. And spoilers, we're going to probably get here, hopefully, but those tribes, Ephraim, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, they are the first tribes to go into captivity when Assyria comes. They are conquered first because they haven't fully gone into what God has for them. So there's a danger there in settling. Yeah. But so that's Joshua. Joshua, he conquers the land. I believe it takes a couple years, and they do it. Joshua, he's an old man, and they've conquered the whole land, and then they settle. And then Joshua kind of ends the book, kind of giving them this challenge, saying, "Hey, I want you to follow the Lord." And they do that for a little bit. The children of Israel, they're in God's promised land. They're following Him. They do that for a little bit, and then kind of what happens?
They disobey.
Yes. I think it was the next generation obeyed, but then the generation after that was the one that really fell away.
It says in the next book, Judges,
Yes.
that new generation, that fresh generation, that next generation didn't know the things of the Lord. They weren't familiar with his miracles and with his works. And because of that, they're just not mindful of the things of God. So God now in this next book sets up these judges that are going to rule Israel. Now, when we think of judge, we think of like courtroom judge. These are different. These are like rulers, not like kings, but more like a king than like a judge, like up at a courthouse. But these are rulers of Israel that God raises up, and there's men and women in these judges. And the book of Judges is jam-packed with just fun stories.
Yes.
Like it's just like the funniest, intense, gruesome, bloody, great little things that are lined out in the book of Judges of a woman.
Not all the stories are so fun, actually.
A woman driving a tent peg through the head of a guy.
That's a fun one, yes.
Gideon, one of my favorite characters in the Bible, is Gideon.
Yeah.
He comes up here in the book of Judges, and God uses him in a mighty, miraculous way of reminding his people of his faithfulness. A judge that we just spent some time not too long ago at a youth retreat teaching on is one of the most famous ones, Jordan. That would be
Samson.
Strong
one.
Strong Nazarite Samson. Take it easy there, big guy.
Oh, sorry, my bad. I'm just stretching.
Strong Nazarite Samson with his hair and his super strength and his downfall of the ladies.
For sure. Yep.
Right there in the book of Judges.
Ehud's a fun one. The guy who stabs the fat king Eglon. He's a great little story there.
There's a story about a woman getting chopped up and mailed out.
Yes,
to the 12
that's
tribes.
the not fun one. Yeah. Well, she dies in this gruesome, awful way, and then yeah. So The book of Judges is interesting because in it we God clearly displays, we could say, man's failure, man's depravity, and probably like the key verse in Judges is the last verse in the whole book, Judges 21:25, and that says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Everyone just did whatever seemed right to them, and that led them into destruction. And in Judges, we see this cycle continue that actually happens throughout probably a lot of the Old Testament. And it's that God's people, they follow God, they're following God with Joshua, but then Joshua goes away. And so they start doing their own thing and they start worshiping other gods and they start disobeying God and not following his law. And so God sends into them, God sends a person to conquer them. And it's all a whole bunch, the Moabites, the Amorites, the Philistines, all these different guys come and conquer them. God uses them. And so then the God's people, they cry out to God for help, help us, help us. So then God raises up a deliverer, a judge who comes and saves them. And then they're like, yay, we're going to follow God. God saved us. And they do that for a little bit until that judge just dies. And then they go right back into rebellion. And then God sends another captor to come get them. And it's just this big old cycle. And it's the cycle of human depravity. And it's a cycle that shows us that that us just trying to follow the law doesn't work. And Judges shows that perfectly again and again and again. The Jews are like, oh, we're going to follow God, we're going to trust him, but then they always mess it up, they always ruin it, and so God has to save their butts again, and then they try again, but then they fail. And so that really, for me, that the cycle there just shows our human inefficiency. Inefficiency, is that a word? Inefficiency?
Sure.
We're not good enough. We can't do it. We can't follow the law. We can't follow God's commandments, even though we try our best. And so Judges shows that cycle.
And you get all the way through Judges, and you realize that God's people are just doing what they want to do. They're doing what's right in their own sight. And then kind of historically, what kind of fits during that time of the Judges is this little 4-chapter story that we have next. That would be the book, one of only 2 books in the Bible named after a woman.
Yep.
The book of Ruth. And Ruth is one of my favorite books. It's short.
A love story.
It's the Jewish Cinderella, I like to call it. It's just a love story. It's a story of redemption. It's a picture of us and Jesus. There's just so much good practical stuff that we can glean, which there's gleaning that happens in the book of Ruth. There's so much practical stuff that we can glean from looking at this short 4-chapter book. And it's a book about a woman who's not a Jewish woman. She's a Midianite woman, and she has tragedy that happens in her life. And she ends up moving back with her mother-in-law to Bethlehem. And as she's in Bethlehem, she's doing what God laid out for the welfare system, which is you could go and you could get the corners of the field to eat. And she's doing that, and she encounters the owner of the field, and his name is
Boaz.
Dreamy Boaz. And
I knew a kid growing up named Boaz.
Did you?
Yep.
How was he?
Homeschooled. But keep going. Yes.
I believe that. He sees her and likes her. She sees him and likes him. They fall in love. And the rest of the story is this pursuit of Boaz for Ruth. They end up getting married. It's great.
And probably getting a little ahead of ourselves, Ruth and Boaz, they get married and they have a son, and that son's name is Obed. And Obed has a son, and that son's name is Jesse. And then Jesse has a kid, and that guy's kid, well, he actually has a bunch of kids, but then the last kid he has is someone named David.
That's right.
And that will be a little important later.
Yeah,
so Ruth and Boaz fit in there.
Ruth is significant because it bridges the gap from Judges to Samuel. It lets you know who this Jesse guy is, who's the father of David, who's going to be a major power player from 2 Samuel onward, even into the New Testament. David's a huge guy that you need to understand. Ruth lets you know that how that connection takes place. So, yeah, I mean, Ruth ends, and we have now the book of 1 Samuel.
One of my favorite books.
Yeah?
I like 1 Samuel.
I like it as well.
It's a good one.
It's named after who?
Samuel.
Who was a
judge.
A judge.
He was the last judge of Israel after Samson died. God raised up Samuel. In the first 6 or 7 chapters of First Samuel talk about that story. Samuel, he was actually a child born, kind of a miraculous birth. His mom really wanted a kid. She couldn't have kids, so she went to the tabernacle and prayed, and the high priest Eli said, hey, you're going to have a kid. First, Eli thought she was drunk because she was being emotional at the tabernacle, and that kind of shows that the spiritual environment at the time was really bad, that there were actually drunk people at the tabernacle of God. And so Eli thought that Samuel's mom was drunk. She wasn't. She was just crying. And so Eli felt bad and basically prophesied that she was going to have her son. So she has a son. And, but before she had the son, she made the promise, God, if I have the son, I'm going to give him back to you. And that's a cool little thing. So she has Samuel, and she weans Samuel, but then after that, she drops Samuel off, a super young boy at the tabernacle, and Samuel's raised in the house of God in the tabernacle. And every year his mom would come see him and bring him a new coat. And that's my favorite little story, because he just gets a new little coat every year. I think it's adorable. But then, so Samuel raises up in the tabernacle. Eli, he was the high priest at the time, and he had some sons. Hagen, didn't he?
Hophni and Phinehas.
Yes.
And they were not the best children.
No.
They were taking advantage of God's people. They were taking the best of the sacrifices of the meat offerings that were being made, and they were consuming it. They were just misrepresenting God is what they were doing. And God isn't pleased with that at all.
Mm-hmm. And so God actually gives Samuel a prophecy about Eli, saying, hey, since you haven't disciplined your adult kids, you haven't stopped them from doing this evil, I'm going to judge you. And Samuel, he gets this message from God, and he tells it to Eli, and Eli kind of accepts it. He doesn't really change anything, so that's not too good. And basically, judgment does come. The Philistines, they attack Israel, and the Israelites get this great idea of, we're under attack. Let's get the Ark of the Covenant, and let's bring that into battle against the Philistines. And previously, them bringing the Ark of the Covenant into battle, they have done that before, and God had commanded that. God didn't command it this time, and they were thinking, we'll bring this lucky charm into battle, and it'll help us. But God's not into just being a lucky charm for them, and since they were disobeying God largely, God didn't like that, and so the Philistines defeat them. They kill Hophni and Phinehas, who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant in there, and they take the Ark of the Covenant. That's kind of a big deal.
That's right. And then Samuel, so he's not just a judge, he's also a prophet.
Yes.
And the Lord, actually, let me back up here. I almost forgot about the most important part. So God's people start looking around at how the rest of the world is being run politically, and they go, we want to be like everyone else. So they start crying out to God, we want a king. We want a king. And God goes, I don't want you to have a king, because I'm your king. You have a theocracy. I'm your king. I have these judges that are executing righteousness, if you will, but I'm your king. But they go, no, we want to be like all the rest of the world. They demanded it, and God goes, if that's what you want, that's what I'll give you. So God raises up a king in Israel who appears for the first bit of his life to be quite an awesome guy. His name's Saul, and he's a nice guy. The Lord uses him in some cool ways. You're like, okay, this is going to be a good character. But as he develops, you realize maybe he's not as good as we first thought.
Man, yeah.
And he's ruling and reigning as that first king in Israel. And the time comes for God to fire him.
Yes.
And he tells Samuel, I'm going to use you to find the next king. And Samuel's scared, because if Saul finds out you're using me to find his replacement, Saul's going to have my head. And God goes, just trust me. Go to Bethlehem. Go to Bethlehem. There of the house of Jesse, back to the book of Ruth, there in the house of Jesse, you're going to find the next king. So Samuel heads out to Jesse's house, and he says, one of your sons is going to be the next king, the Lord has told me. Well, come here, all you boys. And all these boys are lined up, all of Jesse's nice guys, First one, God goes, nope. Second one, God says to Samuel, nope. Third one, nope, nope, nope. Go down the line, nope, 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 nope. That's all the sons that are there at the king picking party. And Samuel says to Jesse, you don't happen to have any other sons, do you? Because I'm sure God said the next king of Israel is going to come from your descendants, and yet we've been through all of them that are here. And he goes, oh, I actually do have one last son, the youngest one. I didn't even invite him because he's the least likeliest to be a king. He's out in the field watching over my sheep. Samuel says, well, bring him in. So he brings him in. This is 1 Samuel chapter 16. He brings him in, and he's the one. God goes, this is the one. And God says to Samuel there, man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And David in that moment was the least likeliest to be king. But that's exactly who God wanted, because God saw David's heart. And how was David's heart, Jordan? He was a man what?
Man after God's own heart. It was like God's.
That's right. Yeah. David had a kindred spirit, a heart like God. And God goes, that's the one I'm going to use. So Samuel pours a bunch of oil on his head and anoints him. Now, David doesn't become king till years later, but he's been anointed to be the king. And Saul is still king. And David's such an interesting fellow because he's strong. He appears to be manly, but he's also very much, not that music makes you soft, but he's a musician.
Yes.
He plays the harp for Saul. When Saul has this distressing spirit, David comes in and plays him some tunes. He writes a lot of the Psalms, so very poetic, very emotional when you read his Psalms. So not really a solid, stable emotionally person, but much more like those people that kind of have big highs and big lows.
Yeah.
So young David gets anointed. And all these things end up happening. But after David's anointing, he knows he's going to be king one day. Saul is still king. And Israel has a giant problem, Jordan.
Yes.
And what is this giant problem?
The Philistines are back. You can't get rid of them.
The Philistines, their enemy number one, keeps taunting them and mocking them. And of these Philistines, there's a big guy named
Goliath
from the region of Gath. And this guy's standing.
One of the last of the Nephilim.
Probably. This guy's standing and actually mocking God's people from across the valley. We don't even all need to fight, he says. You send your best man over here and I'll fight him. Kind of like a Jake Paul, Mike Tyson thing.
Yeah.
Send your best of your best over here.
Okay.
I'm going to fight him. Just one-on-one, and whoever wins that fight will win the entire battle. The problem is no one in Israel wants to fight Goliath because he's huge, a big giant, and he's got a big old mouth on him. You read it. He knows how to talk trash. Yeah. And he's getting into their heads like they do with fights. You know, it's all mental. It's more than just physical. Well, David happens to be on his way to the battle to take some supplies to his brothers who are in the army of the Lord. And David goes, I'll fight him. David goes, I'll take him on. And Saul goes, you can't.
Yeah.
And David goes, no, I want to. And Saul goes, okay. So Saul puts his armor on little David.
Yeah.
Big old King Saul, David's still a young man, puts his armor on him and it drowns him. David goes, this ain't going to work. Your armor doesn't fit me, which is a good application right there, right? My armor isn't good for you and your armor isn't good for me. We got to go with what God's got us going in. He takes it all off and he goes, all I need is a sling and some stones. And that's what he gets. 5 smooth stones and a sling. And he heads out onto that field where Goliath comes and meets him. Goliath talks trash to him.
Yep.
And David says, man, today the people are going to know that you...
And I'm going to feed you to the birds.
That my God... Yeah, David was really good at smack talking too. He goes, I'm going to have your head. I'm going to feed you to the birds. God goes before me. God's going to give me this victory. Hits him, tips over dead, runs up there, cuts his head off with his sword.
Yep.
And it's like, wow.
Yep. And the Philistines go running. And from that moment on, David's kind of famous. He's kind of a celebrity in Israel.
They were writing songs about him.
Yes. He would go out and fight battles with Saul and come back, and the ladies would be singing the song, Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000. thousands. That's actually exactly how they sang it. But
What's
Saul,
that from?
I just came up with that right now. I didn't. That's from this like show I used to see back in Lancaster, the Sight and Sound one.
Oh, a theater thing.
Yeah,
That's
it was
nice.
pretty cool. Yeah, it wasn't a lame theater thing.
And as a result of this, Saul gets pretty jealous,
Yes.
like real jealous.
And Saul at this point is not the most stable man.
Sure.
Right. God has already actually told Saul at this point, "Hey, I'm done with you. I've rejected you, and I'm going to replace you."
That's right.
And so Saul's just kind of hanging on to that, and he's
2 details to know about Saul and David's relationship. Saul promised whoever kills Goliath a few things.
Ooh.
1, you're not going to have to pay taxes, which
Yep.
is a huge benefit. But 2, you get to marry my daughter.
Yep.
And David kills Goliath, so David gets exempt from taxes, and he gets to marry Saul's daughter. So Saul becomes David's father-in-law, and David is also best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan.
Yep.
So all of a sudden, this family dysfunction really starts to grow. Saul hates David. He literally tries to pin him to the wall more than once with a javelin when he's inside his palace. And Saul is on a mission to try to kill David because he knows the prophecies. He knows that David's going to replace him, and he cannot stand it. Jonathan, his best friend, intervenes on behalf of his friend because he knows these plans that his dad is up to. And there's all this mysterious isn't a good word, but just like tension and drama, and David almost dying but escaping.
Yeah, he runs away.
And all these great little plans that take place.
Yep. And he runs away. So David's kind of this king in the wilderness. He's the anointed king, but he doesn't have the kingdom. He's running away. And as he runs away, and this is all basically up to the end of 1 Samuel. This is just the whole drama of 1 Samuel. He finds these other lost people, some other losers, basically, and he turns these groups of losers, and it literally says like everyone who's like in debt, everyone who just like isn't good at life, and they all come to David because they heard that David was hiding out in the mountains, and David takes these groups of losers and turns them into David's mighty men, and we read about them.
They're distressed and they're discontent.
Yes.
These are the 3 words that describe David's friends. And you're often friends with people who are like you.
Yes.
You know, Jordan, you made a comment earlier this week about some friends from Philly that are going to come at the first of the year. And you mentioned how they might be a little bit of a nerds.
Maybe.
And I said, no way would Jordan Schaefer's friends be a little bit of a nerd.
Just a little bit. But they're great guys.
I'm sure they are.
Yeah.
Can't wait to meet them.
Yep, so David gets these mighty men, and so that's kind of the drama for Samuel. David with his mighty men just kind of running away from Saul, Saul almost getting them, Saul going crazy, David running away, Jonathan kind of in the middle, and it ends sadly in the end of 1 Samuel with God killing King Saul. God sends the, I think it's,
Amalekites.
It's the Amalekites, because God had told Saul, hey, wipe out the Amalekites, and Saul kind of obeyed. He didn't really do all of it. He spared a lot of them. And he disobeyed God, and God was like, okay, you're done. You're not going to be king anymore. But it turned out to be an Amalekite who did Saul in. So because he wasn't obedient, that killed him many years down the line.
So you could say his compromise ended up to his detrimise.
Sure, you could say that, yes. And so Saul dies there at the end of 1 Samuel. And that brings us into 2 Samuel. And 2 Samuel, we kind of see, okay, Saul's dead now, so now we get kind of like the rise of David. David, he goes and he becomes king in Jerusalem first, in the land of Judah, the tribe of Judah. He becomes king there first, but the rest of Israel doesn't really acknowledge him as king. So there's kind of this civil war for a little bit. Until David eventually wins. David eventually wins, and he conquers the entire nation, and he is king of Israel years after God had anointed him, but he finally, in 2 Samuel, becomes the king.
And he's a great king.
Yep.
People like him. He's out there with the people. He's fighting the battles with them. He does really, really well for the most part until
Yes.
Until his people are out fighting. It's the season of war.
And he decides to stay home.
He decides to just stay back in the palace. And as he's there, one day he looks out his palace door or his window or whatever, and he sees something that catches his eye. Who does he see?
He sees this chick named Bathsheba taking a bath
What
on
an
the
irony
rooftop.
of her. She's taking a bath on the rooftop of her house, and David saw her.
Yep.
And he wanted her.
Yep. And so he sends the men and says, go find out who this girl is. And they find out who the girl is. And it turns out that Bathsheba is the wife of this man named Uriah. And Uriah and David are actually best friends. Uriah is one of David's mighty men who have been with him for all these years. While David was in the wilderness, Uriah was with him. He helped David become the king. He's been fighting his battles. And he has this wife named Bathsheba. And David sees her. And so then David calls her over.
Right. So David sends his servant, find out who this woman is. The servant comes back and goes, "Oh, David, that's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite."
Yes.
Like she's off the market, bud. And David completely ignores that and goes, "I want her." So he invites her over to the palace, and they have a one-night stand, if you will.
Basically.
And it seemingly seems to be like David got away with this sin. Everything's fine. He got what he wanted. He scratched his itch, if you will. No one's going to know about it except him and Bathsheba. But all of a sudden, don't know how long, a few weeks, a month or so later, David gets word, "David, I'm pregnant." And he goes, "Oh, crap."
Uh-oh. And this is extra bad because Uriah is out fighting the battles, so it couldn't have been...
There's no way Uriah's the daddy.
Yep, so David has to be the daddy. And so now David has this big problem on his hands, and he tries to cover it up by sending word to Joab, the army leader, say, "Hey, bring back Uriah back here." So Uriah comes back, and David's like, "Hey, Uriah, you're doing a great job. Awesome, good. How about you just go and spend a night off? You get the night off. Go spend it with your wife. Go enjoy yourself." And he tries to send Uriah home, but Uriah is really a cool guy in this story. This is awesome. Uriah is like, "It wouldn't be right for me to go home. My fellow soldiers are out in the trenches fighting the Philistines or fighting whoever. They're sleeping outside. It wouldn't be right for me to go home and just enjoy sleeping in my bed with my wife. So I'm going to sleep outside." And Uriah sleeps outside next to the palace. And David, he catches word of this, and he's really upset.
He's like, "Oh."
Yeah, it's like, this didn't work. And so he tries to get Uriah drunk. He says, "Hey, Uriah, stay another day," gets him drunk, and tries to send him home again. But Uriah, even while drunk, still chooses to stay sleep outside. And then David eventually gives up and sends Uriah back. But now he has... he doesn't give up. He gets it more intense. He sends Uriah with this message to Joab, a signed, sealed, concealed message to Joab.
Carried by Uriah.
such a dramatic story. The story's so crazy. Carried by Uriah for Joab. Joab opens it, and the message says, "Hey, put Uriah on the front line, have them attack the wall, but when things get intense, when the battle gets hot, have everyone else retreat, but don't let Uriah retreat." And so that happens, and Uriah dies. And David's like, problem solved.
That's right.
Yes, and then David marries Bathsheba, and he's able to have the kid.
And there's a consequence to all of that.
Yes.
This baby doesn't end up living.
Nope. Yep.
But they do have another kid. And a lot of people forget this. Solomon is the result of David and Bathsheba.
And David had a couple wives, so he had a couple kids. But Solomon was the other one from Bathsheba. Yep.
Yeah. And he'll come up later on in the Bible as a writer. So
that's important.
And also even in 2 Samuel.
Yep. So David's the king, and he does repent of this. Nathaniel, the prophet, comes and confronts David. He gives this whole little parable about a man who had everything and then went and stole another man's sheep, and it was the only sheep that he had and it was the only thing that he loved. And then he was like, "What should we do to this man?" And David was like, "Oh, you should kill the man who was greedy and stole the sheep." And then Nathaniel was like, "You are this man." It was very dramatic. And then David was like, felt really convicted, but he felt like garbage then. And he did repent, and we get I forget which psalm, but which psalm do we have like the repentance of David?
I don't know, maybe 19.
Yeah, one of those. And we have an awesome psalm about David's repentance. It's super, super good. But then so David's the king, and he does a good job mostly. He leads the children of Israel into following God.
He has kind of a screwed up family.
Yes.
His kids are weird.
Oh, yes.
They try to lead these rebellions against him. Absalom, one of David's sons. It's like um, like literally, if you like make a, this is just such good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
This is such good content, and like this is more dramatic and murder-esque and deceitful and dysfunctional than like the best TV like this like Yellowstone.
Better than
Like
Yellowstone,
the
yes.
way it's all
This is
working is just like so
drama.
crazy, and you have the son that wants to take out the father because he wants the power for himself,
Absalom,
and
yep.
he splits the kingdom, and it's just like all of this drama. And David just had a weird relationship with his kids, it appears, where he wasn't able to like discipline them, and it creates a whole lot of problems for him,
Yes.
which is ironic because his son Solomon, when he writes Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, talks a lot about the importance of disciplining children. And I think Solomon does that is because he grew up in a household with none of it.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw how wacky his siblings became. And he's like, learned that lesson by experience. Yeah.
Yep, so then Solomon, he becomes king. David grows old and eventually passes the baton. There's a little, again, family drama with Solomon becoming king. One of the other brothers tries to usurp that, but it all kind of works out in the end. Solomon becomes king.
But before he dies, David wants to build God a house.
Yes,
and
it's
God
important.
goes, nope, you don't get to build me a house.
Yep. God had been dwelling in the tabernacle in a tent, and David's like, it's not fair that I get this big old mansion and God's living in a tent. I want to build God a house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And God goes, no, David, you don't get to do it. You're a man of blood.
Mm-hmm.
You're a man of war. That's not your calling. But your son, Solomon, he can build me a house.
Yep.
So
Solomon, he becomes king. Amazing king. He made Israel super rich, super rich. It said they became so rich that said that silver became like a common thing in that day. Like it wasn't even that big of a deal to have like silver became like dirt. I think they said, yeah, like it wasn't like that big of a deal to have silver. Like they were so rich, and Solomon's able to build God's temple. He builds the first temple to God, and that's a really cool thing. And they're able to have worship there and be able to do all the animal sacrifices from Leviticus now in the temple, and it's an awesome thing. And nations come from all over the place. The Queen of Sheba, she comes, and they're drawn because Solomon had asked for wisdom. God had shown up and said, hey, Solomon, ask me one thing, whatever you want. And Solomon's like, hey, I don't want to mess this up. I want to be able to rule God's kingdom wisely. And so God's like, oh, wow, that's a really good request. Here's some wisdom. And so Solomon, he's super wise, super powerful. Everyone comes over and they're able to see the worship of God, and it's a great thing. And actually, this was kind of like God's whole plan with Israel. Was God wanted the nation of Israel to be his representation amongst the world. God wanted the nation of Israel to represent him and who he was. And during the reign of Solomon, they got the closest to that. And even like the most pagan Gentiles were coming from all over, and they were seeing God, and they were seeing the worship of God, and they were able to learn about God. And many of them were probably drawn to the knowledge of God and saved through that. And it's like, yes, Israel, God was like, Israel, they're my representation. They're my kingdom of priests in this world. And Solomon did that for a little bit. And that didn't work out. And why did Solomon stop being such a great king? What was his problem, Hagen? What was his main problem?
Well, he had an issue specifically with the ladies as well, like we see as a common theme in some of these guys. And God specifically said, I don't want you marrying people that aren't my people, because if you do marry them, they're going to lead your heart after false gods. And that's exactly what happened with Solomon. He marries the daughter of the king of Egypt in a political move of creating an alliance. But the problem is the daughter of the king of Egypt doesn't know the Lord or the things of the Lord. And it slowly starts to lead his heart astray. And that was one of many wives that he had. When I say one of many, I mean 700
and then
wives.
300 concubines.
So Solomon was taking full advantage of his power that he had in this way. And it creates a whole lot of issues for him.
Yep. And then Solomon does die, and he has a son who's going to take over named Adonijah. Oh, sorry, no, not Adonijah. Absalom, right?
Well, Absalom's David's boy.
Oh,
right?
yes. Who's the king that takes over? It's yes. We'll see. It's in First Kings. David. Solomon. All these A names, Hagen. Golly.
Well, real quick as you're looking that up. So,
Yes.
well, I guess not yet. Never mind. So yeah, 1st and 2nd Samuel goes, and then we get into the book of 1st and 2nd Kings.
Yes, and First Kings kind of tells us the story of
Yeah,
Solomon.
Adonijah resumes to be king. First heading in 1st Kings.
Is that? Yeah. I feel like that's okay. Is it Adonijah?
Yeah.
Okay. I believe you.
Now King David was old, advanced in years, and they put a
Yes,
covering on him,
that's King David.
and he could not get warm.
That's the guy who tries to take it from Solomon. So
Therefore-
Solomon's son's somebody else.
So you want me to go deeper?
Well, yes, because we already talked about Solomon.
Oh, here's the death of David. Oh, Solomon executes Adonijah. Wow.
Yes. Yeah, that's dramatic.
Solomon requests wisdom. Okay. The Queen of Sheba. Jeroboam?
Jeroboam and Rehoboam.
Yes.
Yes. Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Jeroboam's his son, right? No, is it Rehoboam his son? Rehoboam's his son, and then Jeroboam. Yeah, so Rehoboam's his son. I'm gonna go off on the limb and say that. So it goes King David, Solomon his son. Solomon has a son named Rehoboam. Rehoboam's a king for like a week, and then messes it all up. He's the king, and the people come to him and say, "Hey, your dad was a little harsh on us. He kind of treated us pretty badly, and so are you going to treat us better?" And Rehoboam thinks about it, and he goes to the old wise elders who had helped his dad make great decisions, and they say, "Hey, be nice to the people. Tell them that you're going to be lighter on them. Be nice to them, and they'll love you forever." And then he goes to his friends, and his friends tell him, "Hey, don't listen to those people. Tell them that you're even going to be harsher than their dad. Tell them that you're going to be like even more strict." And so he listens to his friends. He listens to these yes men around him. He tells the people, "I'm going to be way more tough. The taxes are going to be higher. Work's going to be way more hard. Life's going to get way harder under me." And so the people, they revolt. And Israel splits in two. And they raise up this guy named Jeroboam who takes these 10 tribes. 10 of the tribes, there's 12 tribes, but 10 of the tribes, the northern tribes, they all split away from Judah. And Judah's the main tribe in the south, and Judah also has little Benjamin helping them out. So Judah and Benjamin are in the south, and then Jeroboam with these 10 tribes are in the north. And now there's this split. And there's a civil war going on constantly, but there's a split. Now there's these two nations, and it's called, in the north, it's Israel under Jeroboam, and in the south, it's Judah under Rehoboam. And now we have this awful split, and God's people are divided.
So throughout 1st and 2nd Kings, there's this back and forthness of this tension between the north and the south, and you get all these different kings that come along in 1st and 2nd Kings, but in 1st Kings you get right around to there's two important one important prophet that comes onto the scene.
Yes.
First of all, his name is Elijah, and he is used greatly by God to in a lot of ways. But one of the things that Elijah does is he's sent forth to like speak to the political leaders to let them know what God's doing. It's like, hey, go and talk to this guy and let him know this thing, and tell this guy that I'm up to this. And Elijah has a lot of cool miracles that he does. But one of my favorite ones is 1 Kings chapter 18 with the battle of the gods on Mount Carmel.
Yep.
And it hadn't rained in the land for years because he prayed for no rain. And it didn't rain, the Bible says. And so they go up on this mountain, and it's this fighting, this battle of the gods. And they make these two sacrifices with all this wood. And the idea is whichever God consumes up these sacrifices is the true and living God. So the false prophets of Baal, they do their thing. They pray to their God. Nothing happens. They dance. They roll around on the ground. They cut themselves. They demand, they beg. It's a big, long circus, hours upon hours, and nothing happens. And Elijah goes, "Okay, it's my turn." And he goes, "Oh, well, before I go, dump a bunch of water on my burnt offering,
Mm-hmm.
making it impossible. And he just simply prays a simple prayer. He goes, no, Lord, show up. And sure enough, God shows up. It says the fire came down from heaven, licked up the water, burnt everything, and everyone in the land knows that the Lord is God. And then Elijah, he goes and he starts to pray for it to rain again. And he asks his servant, as he's praying for rain, he goes, what's the sky looking like? There's one little cloud way out there about the size of a man's thumb. Because that's it. He declares it by faith. That's it. That's the rain that's coming. And sure enough, heavens open up again and water starts to pour down. But Elijah's just such a fun guy.
Yep. So we see Elijah there, and with Elijah, we're going to see that there's a lot of prophets who come on the scene, and we're going to get to those later. The first and second Kings, we had this history. First Solomon, but then Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the split. And then continuing on into Second Kings, we just have we follow these two dynasties, these two lines. Israel in the north with their kings, Judah in the south with their kings, and we just have king after king after king after king. In the north, they're super, super wicked. They don't even have a single righteous king. They have a king after a king after a king, and every single one of them is just bad and turns against God and leads the people in rebellion. In the south, where Judah is, they kind of have more of a mix. They have a good king, but then they have a really bad king, and they have a good king, and they have a really bad king, and they go back and forth in the south. And also in the south is where they have the temple, which is important. And many of the people in the north actually migrated back to the south so they could stay in the temple. So a lot of the bad, godless people stayed up in the north, and a lot of the godly people came down to the south. So there's even more of that split there. And so in Second Kings, we just follow the story of these two dynasties, these kings rebelling against God, some of them being good, but most of them being bad, until the end of Second Kings. We have the empire of Assyria coming, and Assyria conquers the kingdom in the north and leads them into captivity. And that's kind of it for them. They kind of get conquered by Assyria, and they're donezo. And we kind of end there with their side of the story. We kind of now focus on God's people in the south. The Jews in the north, they just kind of get dissipated into the nations, into Assyria, and we don't really hear from them ever again. But in the north, we kind of keep on, and they last a little bit longer. They outlive the empire of Assyria. Babylon comes in and conquers Assyria, so now Babylon's a threat, and eventually Babylon comes and Babylon conquers the south, because south, again, even though they had some good kings, they were starting to have mostly bad kings, and so God judges them and brings them into Babylonian captivity for how long, Hagen?
About 70 years.
70 years.
And so this gets into Second Chronicles.
Yep, First and Second Chronicles.
First and Second Chronicles overlap a bit on some history that's already taken place.
First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles are basically the same history, just First and Second Chronicles repeats, basically.
But by the time you get to the end of Second Chronicles, you virtually get to the end of the storyline.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then everything else that we're going to talk about now, we're going to plug back into this timeline somewhere that's already previously taken place.
This is very well laid out timeline.
Saved, Ezra, Nehemiah, but it still fits there at the end of that. So, they get into Babylonian captivity, and they're there for 70 years. But God uses someone.
Mm-hmm.
His name's Daniel.
Yes.
And Daniel.
Do you want to talk about Daniel, or since we're at an hour, do you want to save Daniel and Ezekiel and all them for later?
We should save them.
Okay,
definitely. I just want to say this much. Daniel has insight on what's taking place because of another prophet, Jeremiah, who is writing during this historic timeline as well. So during the time of First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, Isaiah's in there.
Yes.
Jeremiah's in there. Daniel's Hosea, in there once they're in the captivity. So all of these prophets that are later on. So you have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the history from Joshua to Second Chronicles.
Mm-hmm.
Then, as far as how it's laid out in the Bible, we have the
The poetry
The
writing.
poetry.
Yes.
But
Psalms
well,
and
so
Proverbs
actually the history is Joshua
to
to
Nehemiah.
Nehemiah.
Yes.
And then you have the poetry, which is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon.
Which also plug back in because David wrote the Psalms, Solomon wrote Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and so
Right.
those all kind of plug back in as well.
And then you get these major prophets and these minor prophets that come onto the scene that all fit, again, back there previously in the storyline that's taking place. So, if you just read the Old Testament through like a book, by the time you get to virtually Nehemiah, you're done.
The story's over.
The story's over.
Yes.
And everything else that comes after that fitted in previously on the timeline somewhere.
Yep.
So that's the history. Well, let's go up to Ezra, I guess, and Nehemiah. Let's finish the histories and then we'll go.
Yep.
So they end up getting released from Babylonian captivity. Daniel's involved in that. We'll talk about Daniel later on. They get released, and it's like, well, through a guy named Ezra, a portion of them get to go back to Israel.
Yep.
And
not all of them choose to go back, though, right?
That's right. It's God goes, gives his people the opportunity to be set free, and most of them are like, we'll just stay here.
We like it in Babylon.
Yeah, we
nice.
kind of took a liking to this Babylonian lifestyle.
We married people. It's
nice. We're invested in the community. Yes. We can't just leave.
Yeah, we have soccer practice next week.
Yeah,
we can't just go back to God's promised land. But then Ezra leads a group of people back. And actually before that, there was already a group of people led by this guy named Zerubbabel, who's kind of an important guy in the beginning of Ezra, who leads the initial group back. And they're able to rebuild the temple, which is a big deal. Ezra comes back, and Ezra is able to help finish that and kind of be a scribe there, and he leads another people back. And there's problems with people not liking them, and that kind of leads into Nehemiah. And Ezra and Nehemiah, they're kind of around the same time. And Nehemiah, he comes back and he's able to rebuild the wall, which is a big deal, because without a wall in that day, you were a sitting target. You were vulnerable. You could just be plowed over. So Nehemiah comes back and he's able to rebuild the wall. And there's a bunch of people, was it Sanballat something? I forget what kind of Hamorite or Tamorite or Sanarite he was. But this guy named Sanballat, he doesn't like that, and he fights against that. But Nehemiah leads the people and says, nope, we're going to rebuild this wall. And Nehemiah tells the people, hey, have a sword in one hand and have a shovel in the other. Build the wall, but be ready and have a sword in the other hand. And that's a great picture of us as Christians. We want to be building people up, doing things, but we want to be ready. We want to be ready to fight against the enemy. Shovel in one hand, sword in the other hand. So they're able to rebuild the wall, and they're doing that. And they, like you said, Hagen, the history of the Old Testament stops there. They have the temple, they have the wall, they're back in the promised land. And then 400 years later, Jesus was born. And there's not that big of a gap between the end of Nehemiah and the beginning of Matthew. Only 400 years are in between those. The people come back, and they're able to restart their society there. And then, Jesus is born, and then we kind of pick up this story in Matthew. But we have a bunch of the poetry and the prophets to go back, and they add a lot of details to the story, to this history that we've just laid out. Yeah.
Two quick resources I want to mention as we wrap this up. Both are free on YouTube. One, Chuck Missler has a teaching out there called Learn the Bible in 24 Hours, where he does this essentially. More detailed, because he does it in a whole 24-hour span. So 24-hour-long sessions virtually, where he does an overview of the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation, which I would really recommend. Another one, Skip Heitzig from Calvary Chapel, Albuquerque, did a thing a couple years back. He called it the Bible from 30,000 feet. And each message, he looks at a book of the Bible, and just the hour-long message is just covering a book. And he does a really good job of just summarizing what each book is about. So both of those free on YouTube. Chuck Missler, Learn the Bible in 24 Hours, and Skip Heitzig from Calvary Chapel, Albuquerque, the Bible from 30,000 feet, his overview of each book of the Bible, I would highly recommend.
For sure.
And I promise theirs will be a little bit more laid out than ours.
But I think ours is pretty good. Yeah, I like ours.
Ours is fun.
I think we got all the important stuff.
Yes.
I think so. Yeah.
We missed out on Elisha, but that's okay.
That's okay.
He's in there.
He's in there.
You got to read it if you really want it all.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's
You
plenty.
can't just
There's
be
plenty.
relying on
There's
us.
plenty of stuff that we didn't talk about.
Sure.
Yeah. But cool. Well, guys, thanks for spending this hour listening
And
to us.
this is actually going to air on Black Friday.
Wow.
So the happy day after Thanksgiving. Hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving with family and friends, and looking forward to getting into the Christmas season.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
That's right.
See ya.
Bye.